Use of force and context. Now, one area of work that I get involved in is the use of force with detained people, and custody covers from the point of the initial call for service, so the initial interactions with the person, any subsequent arrest, the use of force, the transport to the custody unit, the actual booking in and everything that happens in the custody unit. So what I often find in relation to use of force is that it is assessed against the technique, whether or not it was a perfectly performed technique. Now, that is wrong, and use of force should never be assessed purely as to whether it is a correct technique or not. It's one aspect to take into consideration, but it shouldn't be the sole issue. Now, when we've got the issue of use of force, whether or not it's a correctly applied technique, it comes down to, was it necessary, reasonable or proportionate in those circumstances at that time by that officer. So things to consider: was there a lawful police purpose, and was it the least amount of force used that was a reasonable tactical response? There is no list of illegal techniques. All techniques are on the table subject to justification in relation to threat and risk and a whole host of other issues. Particularly, the main core issue is the national decision-making model, which the officer is required to justify any use of force against. And the starting principle for any use of force is that any use of force is unlawful unless it is justified. So that's no matter what the severity of it is, it must be justified by that individual officer in those particular circumstances. So when we're looking at the National Decision Making Model, or the NDM, the first issue to consider is the information or intelligence that that officer has had. So sometimes this may come down to the issues from the control room. Have they actually passed the information that they have? Have they passed it correctly to the officer? Or is the information given to the officer misleading, and therefore the foundations are wrong, which the officer has started commencing their NDM upon? Threat and risk then, and that's threat and risk to the officer or officers involved, the public, and to the subject themselves. Is it a criminal justice response that the officers are attending, or is it a medical response, such as it's a mental health call, or is it a mixture of the two? Because that will also affect the policing purpose. Are they attending to arrest and deal with a criminal justice response, or is it in relation to a place of safety for a extremely vulnerable person who needs medical attention? Subject profile behaviours, the officer needs to consider a whole variety, the 6 classifications in relation to compliance and lack of compliance. And for example, the threat of a knife being there, that in itself would be an aggravating factor, regardless of whether the officer has seen a knife. If the information given to them is that the person is in possession of a knife and or has threatened to use the knife, then that would still be an aggravating factor regardless of whether the officer has seen the knife or not. Then there's also a mnemonic that's used called THRIVE, which stands for threat, harm, risks, the investigation purpose, so that will bring us back to whether it's criminal justice or whether it's a medical issue, the vulnerability of the subject as well, and also what is the actual engagement plan. Then when any use of force is used, or if it's used, the officer must always consider medical aid and appropriate and suitable medical aid as soon as possible thereafter. So when dealing with a use of force case, one of the things that I want to look at is everything from the point of the initial call for service right up to even after custody, because particularly around the techniques used, has the officer reported as soon as possible and upon arrival to the custody unit staff what force was actually used? Because if, for example, a strike has been given to the head area or to the spine area, it doesn't mean to say it was wrong or unlawful, but it does mean that medical aid needs to be brought to that detained person. So one of the issues there is, well, if the officer has been honest right from the start and said what techniques and what's happened, then there's information there which is looking at the whole circumstances. So the main thing here, the point I want to get over is use of force must never be assessed purely on whether it is an approved technique and whether it was textbook perfect, because it's rare in real circumstances that the use of force is perfectly administered. However, any use of force that is used must be for a lawful policing purpose, and it must be justified as necessary, reasonable and proportionate in those circumstances at that particular time by that officer. And you can contact me for any further discussion on this topic. Joanne Caffrey. Thank you.